On the morning of November 5th, Frank Delaney found a mint green envelope tucked into his screen door, printed with the words, "Urgent, Community Standards." He stood there for a moment, blinking into the sunlight that soaked the stucco homes of Mesa Ridge Gardens in a golden wash. A hummingbird darted by his head toward the feeder he'd only half-assembled yesterday, and the faint smell of citrus and warm gravel hung in the air. Frank adjusted the waist of his slacks, glanced at the envelope again, and sighed. His coffee had barely cooled. He carried the envelope inside, placing it carefully between the pages of the Arizona Republic he'd picked up from the curb. He wasn't expecting mail yet. His change of address form had only gone in last week, and besides, he hadn't met a single neighbor who knew his name. The envelope, however, certainly knew his address. Inside was a cheerful letter printed on pale cardstock, welcoming him to the community with phrases like sunshine, smiles, and shared standards. It included a map of Mesa Ridge Gardens, a contact sheet for board members, and, most prominently, a folded insert titled Unofficial Parking Expectations. Joyce Weller's name was in bold at the bottom, above a quote in script font, "A tidy curb reflects a tidy soul." A diagram showed preferred vehicle orientations for holiday harmony. Frank frowned. His driveway was barely longer than his truck. He flipped through the rest of the materials, pausing at the HOA calendar, Decor Guidelines Submission Week, Saguaro Awareness Day, and a note about an upcoming Community Holiday Harmony workshop. Whatever that meant. Outside, the breeze kicked up a few desert leaves and one rogue candy wrapper. The neighborhood looked pleasant enough, ranch-style homes, tidy shrubs, and the occasional fake owl perched to scare off pigeons. But Frank felt a flutter in his stomach. He'd just moved from a quiet cul-de-sac in Minnesota where people waved and kept their noses out of each other's garages. Arizona was sunnier, sure. But this envelope felt watchful. That afternoon, Frank wandered down to the bulletin board by the clubhouse. It was a tall slab of cork with a plastic cover and brass trim that caught the light just enough to blind someone standing at the wrong angle. Behind the glass, laminated rules, schedules, and a printed suggestion slip form with carbon copies still available. Prominently featured in the center was Joyce's diagram again, this time larger, in full color. A red arrow snaked through the cul-de-sacs indicating preferred guest flow. Another labeled Holiday Overflow Zone had a pin stuck right in front of Frank's address. A yellow sticky note stuck to the glass read, "Let's be good neighbors this season." He heard a creak behind him and turned to see a man in a fishing vest and cargo shorts approaching from across the street, holding a metal toolbox in one hand and a paper cup in the other. "You must be the new truck guy," the man said. Frank offered a tentative smile. "Frank Delaney. Just moved in last week. Terry Lou. Welcome to paradise." He gestured toward the board. "Seen the commandments yet?" Frank raised the folder slightly. "Got the mint green gospel this morning." Terry snorted. "Just don't block the aesthetic airflow or she'll cite you." Frank chuckled, unsure if that was a joke or a warning. "She?" he asked. "Joyce. HOA VP. Clipboard enthusiast. Watch your mailbox. And your headlights." He took a sip of his coffee and looked across the street toward Frank's driveway. "That a Ford? F-150. Stock. Nothing fancy." "She hates that. Says it throws off the community silhouette." Terry's parrot Dennis squawked from somewhere inside the house. "You'll get used to it. Or not." They parted with a neighborly wave, and Frank walked home past the neat gravel beds and decorative stepping stones. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the quote, "A tidy curb reflects a tidy soul." It echoed in his head like a passive-aggressive proverb. The next morning, Frank stepped outside to grab the paper and stopped mid-step. Pinned under his windshield wiper was a bright orange slip labeled Courtesy Reminder. Typed underneath was the phrase, "Please align all vehicles according to community diagram to maintain driveway symmetry. Non-compliance may result in a friendly follow-up." It was signed, once again, by Joyce Weller. Frank sat at the kitchen table later that morning with the HOA handbook open beside his oatmeal. Section 3A addressed vehicle visibility. Section 5b referred to maintenance. But nothing mentioned aesthetic airflow or overflow zone assignments. Still, the rules Joyce pushed had a life of their own. He began to understand why Terry had smirked. Midday sun pooled across his porch. Frank fetched his mail, sorting through a supermarket flyer and one postcard from his nephew. And then he saw it. Another flyer, printed on thick cream paper, with red and green snowflakes dancing across the top. Holiday overflow guest parking zones, suggested assignments. His address was highlighted in yellow. At the corner cafe, Loretta Green pointed to the laminated chart hanging by the register. That's Joyce's parking flow map. Looks like a military evacuation plan. Frank peered over his bifocals at the glossy print. Red and green arrows wove through the cul-de-sacs of Mesa Ridge Gardens like attack vectors, complete with staging zones, ingress paths, and labeled driveways. His was marked with a cheerful starburst reading, Prime Overflow Opportunity. Impressive, Frank said, deadpan. Missing only a legend and a security clearance. Loretta snorted into her tea. She laminated that herself. First draft was in crayon, rumor has it. The cafe was quiet that morning. A few regulars sipped black coffee from chipped mugs, their conversation low and tinged with complaint. A waitress in orthopedic sneakers slid past with a basket of wrapped apple muffins. By the window, two women in cardigans traded knowing glances toward the board and muttered about her latest diagrams. Frank's mind wandered briefly to his audit days. Whenever someone submitted maps or color-coded forms for something like paperclip inventory, it wasn't because they cared about clarity, it was because they were hiding something convoluted beneath it. Loretta leaned across the table, voice low. You know she tried this 2 years ago, right? Tried what? The overflow rules. Had a whole folder full of curbside flow logic. She pushed it during Thanksgiving week. Quietly shelved after 3 residents banded together and threatened to call the city about personal curb annexation. Why didn't anyone object this time? Because people are tired. They'd rather tape a flyer to their mailbox than speak up. Frank sipped his coffee, watching sunlight drift across the floor tiles. He glanced again at the map. His address stood out in bold. Guest Harmony Zone, it said. He had to admit, the branding was effective in a vaguely dystopian way. That afternoon, back at the HOA clubhouse, Frank checked the glass-cased bulletin again. Sure enough, there were now 3 laminated postings: overflow policy for holiday visitors, driveway orientation best practices, and a sign-up sheet for volunteer curb monitors. At least 10 names had been scratched out with ballpoint pen. He walked home with slow, deliberate steps. On the way, he passed Betty Chandler in her front yard trimming the edge of her lawn with manicure scissors. The HOA secretary barely looked up, murmuring a hello with the enthusiasm of someone reciting a sentence they'd memorized in court. Betty, he said casually, when's the next public HOA meeting? She paused, scissors in mid-snip. I believe Joyce postponed it. Indefinitely. Is that allowed? She hesitated, blinked at her hedge, and resumed trimming. Joyce says we need to focus on community cohesion right now. Frank nodded. And cohesion comes from laminated parking rules? Betty didn't answer. That evening, Frank opened a new file folder in his desk drawer, Mesa HOA Observations. Inside, he placed each flyer Joyce had distributed, organized by date. He circled repeated fonts. Arial bold seemed to indicate reminders, while Times New Roman carried an air of threat. There were decorative borders, unnecessary exclamation points, and a penchant for using clipart gavel icons to suggest non-existent authority. He included a note: no official HOA signature or meeting minutes found on any of these documents. The next morning, as Frank was sipping coffee and admiring a particularly well-balanced row of lawn gnomes across the street, a knock sounded at the door. Joyce stood on the porch, as if conjured by sarcasm. Her hair was pulled tight, her smile tighter. She held a plastic sleeve with a color printout inside. Hi there, Mr. Delaney. I just wanted to drop off our holiday guest harmony proposal. Frank took it without speaking. Joyce's smile widened. We're encouraging residents with wide, straight driveways, like yours, to accommodate guest vehicles for community gatherings this weekend. It's really about collective ease. Frank glanced at the chart. His address again starred, this time with added notes: flat access, low curb elevation, optimal alignment. It was annotated like a landing zone. She continued, if you could move your truck to the overflow lot on Valencia Avenue for Friday through Sunday, it would really help promote cohesion. Frank raised an eyebrow. Overflow lot? You mean the gravel patch next to the drainage ditch? It's been designated unofficially by the HOA Comfort Committee. I thought there was no such committee. Joyce ignored that. We'd appreciate your cooperation. Guest harmony is something we all share. Frank nodded slowly. Thank you for letting me know. That afternoon, he reviewed the bylaws again. Still nothing about overflow zones or curb harmony directives. Section 6B referenced event parking guidelines, but required board vote and posted meeting minutes, of which there had been none. He underlined the clause and added a sticky note: no comfort committee exists. As the sun dipped over the neighborhood, casting long shadows over the pebbled driveways and rustling the wind chimes that had somehow escaped fines, Frank poured himself a glass of iced tea and walked to his mailbox. Joyce stood across the street in her driveway, clipboard in hand, muttering into a Bluetooth headset no one could confirm was connected to anything. He raised his glass to her. That won't be necessary. Next scene, Frank's camera captures Joyce pacing across the street, clipboard in hand. At exactly 3:04 a.m. on November 10th, flashing red and blue lights bounced off Frank's ceiling, followed by a knock and the words, Mesa PD, open up. He sat bolt upright, heart pounding beneath his thermal Henley. For a moment, he imagined coyotes, or maybe a water main burst. But as he shuffled to the door in socks and sweatpants, he glimpsed his truck through the front window, bathed in the alternating glow of the cruiser lights. Two officers stood on his porch, one checking a notepad, the other squinting at his truck like it might grow teeth and charge. Frank opened the door slowly. Sir, the taller officer began, we received a report of a suspicious, possibly abandoned vehicle parked in your driveway. Frank blinked. You mean, my truck? That's correct. It's insured, registered, and has been parked there since Tuesday. Understood. We're just following up. Caller mentioned it was obstructing neighborhood flow and described it as aggressively stationary. The younger officer coughed lightly into his hand, clearly fighting a grin. Frank stepped out into the crisp desert air, motioning toward the F-150. It's a 2019. Never blocked anything. I checked the bylaws twice. The taller officer walked over, circled the truck, then nodded. No violations that we can see. The younger one leaned in and said under his breath, you're not the first. Last year she reported a mailbox with rebellious posture. Claimed it was tilted in protest. Frank raised an eyebrow. Joyce? The officer didn't answer, but his smirk said enough. They took down Frank's name, noted there was no cause for further action, and left with a polite nod. The cruiser rolled away into the night, its lights fading like an overdone theater effect. Across the street, behind louvered blinds, a silhouette shifted. Frank stood for a while in his doorway, watching the wind nudge his hummingbird feeder. Then he closed the door, clicked the deadbolt, and walked straight to his computer. By sunrise, a new motion-activated camera was ordered, along with a box of laminated, smile, you're on camera signs. Frank wasn't angry. He wasn't even flustered. What he felt was sharper, the click of something falling into place. Around 10 a.m., Loretta appeared at his door with a tray of cinnamon rolls and a folder thicker than a seasonal Pottery Barn catalog. I brought the bylaws, she said, breezing in. And carbs. They go together. Frank poured 2 cups of coffee and set the tray between them at the table. She called the cops? Loretta asked. He nodded. Loretta exhaled slowly, flipping open her folder. Time to escalate our response. I've already bookmarked everything she's violated this quarter alone. Also, Betty's been muttering in the craft room, says Joyce is planning something big. Frank's inbox chimed. A new email, subject line in all caps, Enforcement Initiative. He opened it. Attached was a glossy PDF with the Mesa Ridge Gardens logo, badly pixelated, and multiple drone shots of his driveway. One photo had arrows drawn over the truck like it was part of a logistics drill. Text overlay read, Vehicular Assertiveness Disruption, Case File hashtag F150A. Loretta leaned in. Is that Comic Sans? He sighed. Of course it is. Terry arrived 10 minutes later with a USB stick and a manila folder. I started a digital archive, he said, tossing it on the table. I'm calling it Operation HOA Abomination. Frank smiled. We'll need categories. Already set, flyers, footage, bylaw fiction, and drone drama. They spent the afternoon sorting documents, scanning flyers, and setting up a shared Google Drive. At one point, Loretta pulled out the HOA charter. She's not allowed to hold both VP and treasurer roles, she said, tapping the page. Section 8, Subclause D. She's breaking her own system. Frank looked at the diagram Joyce had sent. Arrows, overlays, terminology, none of it made sense. But she sure prints it like gospel, he muttered. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting warm light across tidy sidewalks and saguaros decorated in early Christmas flair. A breeze carried the faint tinkling of wind chimes, illegal only if excessive, according to Joyce's last flyer. Inside Frank's living room, the battle lines were being drawn. Not with rage or yelling, but with paperwork, cinnamon rolls, and a folder titled Rebellion by Regulation. The binder was thick, laminated, and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Joyce had dropped it off with a sticky note, for your compliance review. Let's keep things harmonious. Frank stared at the glossy plastic cover from his porch chair, the morning sun glinting off the spine like it was trying to blind him into submission. The title, in Joyce's favorite pseudo-corporate font, read, Suggested Vehicular Harmonization, Volume 2. He hadn't seen Volume 1, and suspected no one had. Still, Volume 2 came with tabs, color-coded inserts, and an appendix labeled, Curb Flow Respectfulness Zones. Inside, there were full-page diagrams showing hypothetical guest arrivals. Arrows looped and twisted over driveway maps like air traffic control schematics. One had a caption that read, Scenario B, Split Arrival, Guests with Wheelchair and Oversized Sedan Arrive Simultaneously. Another outlined a reverse flow contingency, which, according to footnotes, required at least one vehicle to temporarily mount a curb for maximal rotational grace. Frank let out a quiet sigh and reached for his coffee. The binder thudded against the table as he closed it. If it's color-coded and spiral-bound, it's not optional. It's war, Terry had said. He hadn't been wrong. That afternoon, as Frank walked the sidewalk loop that circled Mesa Ridge Gardens, he noticed several neighbors stepping around bright orange cones arranged in semi-precise patterns in front of his house. Chalk arrows had been drawn near his mailbox, pointing toward a single phrase written in looping letters, Overflow Harmony Drill, Phase 2. Joyce stood nearby with a visor, clipboard, and what looked like a Bluetooth mic, not connected to anything. She waved one hand in the air and barked, Now imagine Aunt Doris arrives and there's no clear ingress path. Oh, the confusion, the chaos. Frank blinked. Let's reset the sedan staging area, Joyce called, as she rearranged two cones beside his driveway. Neighbors emerged from behind curtains. Mr. Rosenthal, 3 houses down, leaned on his rake and shook his head. I haven't seen this much binder drama since prom seating in '72, he muttered to no one. Loretta appeared shortly after, marching down the sidewalk in orthopedic sandals with a grocery tote labeled Due Process slung over her shoulder. She planted herself beside Frank. Tell me she did not draw an ingress map for Aunt Doris. Frank pointed toward the chalk diagram. You tell me. Loretta pursed her lips, pulled a folded HOA rulebook from her tote, and began circling violations with a red pen. No quorum. No scheduled drill. No emergency protocol filing. This woman is reenacting D-Day in your driveway. Back inside, they spread out the binder on Frank's kitchen table. It contained 10 sections, 3 annexes, and, Frank counted, 6 pages with embossed gold stars. Joyce had even included a pie chart comparing curb compliance by residents, labeling his home as lowest harmony potential. Terry arrived not long after, holding a USB drive. "I'll scan everything," he said, setting up a small portable scanner on the counter. "We need a digital record." Operation HOA Abomination just leveled up. They spent 2 hours categorizing each page: Joyce's, guest flow forecasts, her, seasonal congestion risks, and a folder ominously titled Patio Encroachment Indicators. Outside, the cones remained, now joined by a laminated sign stuck into Frank's lawn: Preliminary Test Zone, Do Not Park. Around dusk, Frank peeked through his curtains and saw Joyce pacing the sidewalk again, gesturing at imaginary guests as she narrated. Aunt Doris backs up, sees the blockage, panics. Now Uncle Ray's sedan can't execute a clean angle. At that moment, a phone clicked. From across the street, a teenager raised a phone camera toward Joyce, smirking. Then another neighbor followed suit. A third neighbor, holding a small dog, whispered, "World War Curb." Joyce froze mid-gesture, suddenly aware of the small crowd now watching her community theater. She pretended to take a call and briskly walked back toward her porch, clipboard clutched tight. That evening, just after sunset, Frank heard a knock on the door, soft, quick, almost apologetic. He opened it to find Betty standing there, eyes darting nervously toward Joyce's house. Without a word, she extended a small flash drive wrapped in a napkin. "You didn't get this from me," she said. Then she turned and disappeared into the darkness, her porch light flickering on behind her like nothing had happened. Over coffee and bran muffins at the corner cafe, Loretta opened her worn copy of the bylaws and said, "1/3 signatures. That's all we need." Frank leaned in, brushing muffin crumbs from the laminated table. "How many residents total?" 84, she replied without checking. "Which means we need 28. I say we get 40. For flair." The side patio buzzed with the soft hum of ceiling fans and the clink of ceramic mugs. Mr. Rosenthal played a quiet sax riff in the far corner while Mrs. Klein refilled the napkin holders with holiday-themed prints. A hand-drawn chalk sign by the door read, "Today's special, reasonable expectations." Terry arrived with a folder under one arm and a box of flyers in the other. "We're live," he announced, slapping one onto the table. Bold font read, "Protect your driveway, sign today." Frank flipped through the first page of the petition Loretta had drafted. The language was tight, precise, and unmistakably legal. Years of court clerkship had honed her gift for writing documents that left no wiggle room. Special HOA meeting requested under Bylaw Section 7, Subsection C. Reason, allegations of procedural misconduct, falsified communications, and weaponized guest management policies. "Nice touch," Frank said. Loretta beamed. "I almost added cone-related tyranny but decided to stay classy." They split the flyers 3 ways and began canvassing. Frank started on Hawthorne Loop, clipboard in hand. He knocked on doors, ready with a friendly smile and a brief explanation. To his surprise, most neighbors were eager, relieved, even. One woman showed him a laminated violation for having a bird feeder that disrupted the avian migration narrative. Another man admitted he'd received a warning about his Halloween decor being too interpretive. Mrs. Klein pulled him aside by her garden gnome. "She fined me last Easter," she whispered. "Claimed my flamingo had an irreverent posture." Frank glanced at the bird, currently wearing a miniature top hat and holding a sign that read, "I'm retired, not silent." "She's going on the lawn during the meeting," Mrs. Klein declared. Front and center. Jason, the ex-Marine from Birch Lane, stood with arms crossed at his front porch. "Never liked that woman," he said. "Joined this community for peace and a good HOA barbecue, not monthly citations about my mailbox being too masculine." When Frank offered the clipboard, Jason signed with a flourish. "I'm in. Just this once." Back at Frank's place, the doorbell rang. Betty stood there, glancing nervously behind her. "I can't sign," she said quietly, "but I can tell you this, Joyce hasn't followed protocol for over a year. No votes, no posted minutes. Just announcements and laminated notices. Half the board is afraid of her." Frank nodded slowly. "Can you send me anything?" "I'll try," Betty said, already stepping back into the shadows. "Just be careful. She plays dirty." By late afternoon, the tally was 41 signatures. Terry carried them in a stiff manila folder labeled, "Curb Rebellion, Verified." "I say we do it with style," he said, pulling duct tape from his cargo shorts. They walked to Joyce's house, where the orange cone still stood, an accidental monument to authority gone too far. Frank held the folder in place while Terry secured it to the cone with 2 clean strips of tape. Across the street, Loretta took a photo with a camera that looked like it had documented at least 3 other uprisings. Then, they emailed the digital copy to the full board with all supporting documents attached: flyers, photos, Betty's notes, and Joyce's binder scans. Frank exhaled. "It's done." That evening, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. People nodded at Frank from their porches. Several mailbox flags fluttered with small sticky notes that read, "We stand with Frank." Just after sunset, a new delivery arrived. Glossy, full-color flyers slipped under every door, tucked into garden fences, pinned to bulletin boards. Title: Truth, Trust, and Trucks, What You're Not Being Told. Joyce's face, serene, confident, was watermarked behind every paragraph. Her eyes seemed to follow the reader. Frank held it up to the porch light, scanning the rhetoric about vehicular intimidation and the weaponization of non-neutral paint jobs. He sighed and turned to Loretta, who stood beside him with a tin of fudge. "She's escalating," he said. Loretta offered a square and shrugged. "Good. That means we're close." The HOA clubhouse smelled of peppermint hand sanitizer and poorly masked tension. Folding chairs creaked as residents settled in for the spectacle. A projector hummed in the corner, hummingbird-printed curtains drawn closed over the windows. Quilted vests rustled. Someone placed a tray of lemon squares near the sign-in sheet. In the back row, Mrs. Klein quietly knitted beneath a hand-lettered poster leaning against her walker, "My curb, my rules." Frank stood near the side wall, binder tucked under one arm, thermos of decaf in the other. He glanced at the flyer Joyce had posted just days before, "Vehicular Aesthetics and You, a Community Reminder." It was printed on glossy stock and included a quote attributed to anonymous board consensus, which, as far as anyone could tell, meant Joyce alone. At precisely 6:01 p.m., Betty rose from behind the folding table at the front and tapped the mic, which squealed in protest. "We'll now begin tonight's special meeting of the Mesa Ridge Gardens HOA, she said, voice quivering slightly. Per Section 7, Subsection C of the Charter, this meeting was called via petition with 41 signatures. First item, resident concerns. Joyce stood before anyone else could. As acting vice president, she began, "I'd like to open with a statement on the importance of curb harmony and our shared visual ethos." Loretta stood abruptly from the third row, waving a printed agenda in the air. "You're not chairing tonight, Joyce. You're on it." Murmurs rippled across the room. Joyce's mouth opened, then closed. She sat stiffly, smoothing her skirt with unnecessary precision. Residents took the floor one by one. Mr. Rosenthal described how he'd been cited for musical intrusion when practicing his saxophone on the porch. A couple shared how they'd received a warning about a planter box, too whimsical in proportion. A woman named Claire, nearly in tears, recalled receiving 3 notices in 2 weeks, all unsigned but in identical formatting. Terry handed Frank the binder, who rose and walked to the front table. He clicked open the metal clasps and flipped through the tabs with measured clarity. "Each section here," Frank began, "is organized by date and theme. We've cataloged every flyer, citation, and unofficial directive issued by Ms. Weller over the last 3 months. Including those involving fabricated violations, personal targeting, and misuse of HOA tone and resources." He paused, pulling out a laminated sheet labeled case file #F150A. This drone image, for example, shows my driveway. It was used in a flyer accusing me of vehicular assertiveness. He held it up. The truck hasn't moved in days. It's registered. Legal. And more importantly, permitted under our actual bylaws. Snickers broke out from the side rows. He continued. We also have the 911 call logs for 2 police visits. Both deemed unfounded. Both instigated by the same caller. Betty's hands trembled slightly as she took the printed pages Frank handed her. She looked out over the crowd and exhaled. Loretta approached the mic. Clause 4, subsection C, our bylaws, clearly prohibit one individual from serving simultaneously as vice president and treasurer. Yet Ms. Weller has done so for 14 months. She held up the charter, pages tabbed with red flags. Without a board vote. Without transparency. Without accountability. Joyce shifted in her seat, eyes narrowing. Frank stepped back up. This isn't about a truck. It's about who gets to decide what community means. Silence followed, brief, still, but electric. Then Betty cleared her throat. We'll now take a vote. All in favor of reviewing Ms. Weller's conduct and relieving her of current roles. Hands rose. One row. Then another. Then nearly every hand in the room. All but one. Joyce remained seated, arms folded, lips tight as concrete. Betty nodded softly. Motion passes. Joyce stood slowly, her folders stacked neatly, her expression unreadable. You'll regret this, she said. I brought order. Loretta, now munching on a sugar cookie, didn't miss a beat. Order isn't dictatorship, darling. Frank found the envelope on his doorstep at 7:13 a.m. sharp serif label. Certified. Inside, a 5-page cease and desist letter in Comic Sans. He stared at it for a full minute, blinking like he'd read it wrong. But there it was. Paragraphs accusing him of vehicular defamation, community destabilization, and, his personal favorite, undermining the curb appeal narrative. The font danced across the page like a prank from a junior high student with a flair for drama. By the time Frank sat down at his dining table, the letter spread open beside his oatmeal and reading glasses, Loretta had already burst out laughing. She actually sent this, she wheezed, clutching her crocheted tote like it was keeping her upright. In Comic Sans? Frank nodded. With 2 logos, neither of which are real. Terry leaned over the table, scanning the 3rd page. Weaponized noncompliance via vehicular symbolism, I've got to start writing like this. My HOA memos would win awards. Frank flipped open his laptop and dropped the letter into the shared drive, HOA shenanigans, final phase. We're beyond flyers now, he said. Time to get someone who knows their way around legalese and lemonade. He dialed his cousin Sam, retired lawyer, championship barbecue pitmaster, and part-time HOA nemesis from back in Omaha. Tell me it's not another driveway dispute, Sam said on speaker. She cited me for destabilizing community morale. In Comic Sans. Sam paused. Then chuckled. That's not a lawsuit. That's a therapy letter. An hour later, Sam arrived in flip-flops, holding a jug of lemonade and a briefcase that smelled faintly of mesquite smoke. They cleared the table of cinnamon roll crumbs and HOA maps. Sam pulled out a yellow legal pad. First, we draft a civil harassment complaint. Then we file a transparency request with the city to audit HOA expenses. He clicked a pen and looked at Frank. Did she ever actually approve her spending with a board vote? Define approve. Loretta slid a folder across the table. Betty sent this last night. HOA expenditures for the past 6 months. Sam flipped through it, eyebrows climbing. $3, $200 labeled curb aesthetic campaign materials, with no receipts. What even is that? Terry pointed. Flags. With Joyce's face. She called them visual unity beacons. There's one planted next to the HOA bulletin board. Sam shook his head. She's been running a one-woman image cult. Frank printed the letter. Sam stapled it to the legal filing with a little more force than necessary. By the next morning, the paperwork had been submitted. The city clerk, when reading the accusation of parking posture terrorism, reportedly asked if it was part of a satire skit. Joyce, undeterred, launched a Facebook page titled Truck Tyranny, Mesa's Moral Decline. The banner was a blurry zoom-in of Frank's Ford, heavily filtered to look sinister. The posts read like HOA-themed conspiracy theories. Today, we confront the unchecked vehicular dominance plaguing our sidewalks. Loretta read it aloud at the corner cafe while sipping chamomile. She signs her posts as Community Image Steward, she said, nearly snorting her tea. She's more creative than compliant, Frank said. By evening, half the neighborhood was talking about the page. The comments section was already overrun with memes. One showed a flamingo lawn ornament saluting the truck. Another featured Joyce's flyer with a new tagline, "When curb control goes curb crazy." And then came the real twist. Terry burst onto Frank's porch, slightly out of breath. "There's a news van," he said. "Parked right in front of her house." Frank stepped outside. Sure enough, a white truck with a satellite dish and local news logo sat 2 driveways down. A cameraman was adjusting his tripod. The anchor, clipboard in hand, turned to the camera and smiled. "We're here for a story on community cohesion, or the lack thereof." Joyce's farewell livestream had 11 viewers, 2 angry reacts, and 1 raccoon caught in the frame. She ended with, "You'll all miss the order I brought." The video circulated briefly on the neighborhood group chat before being buried beneath memes, potluck photos, and a digital flyer for the upcoming Karen Free Friday celebration. Frank watched a few seconds of it, just enough to catch Joyce waving from a folding chair flanked by a plastic podium and a traffic cone. Her voice trembled with self-righteousness. The raccoon knocked over a plastic cup and vanished off camera. That morning, the Mesa City Clerk's office officially posted the results of their investigation. Fines issued to Joyce Weller totaling $950 for misuse of emergency services and unauthorized signage campaigns. Another violation cited improper access to HOA reserve funds, particularly for purchasing custom yard flags bearing her face and the slogan "Order, Harmony, Compliance." The HOA board, now refreshed and distinctly Joyce-free, voted unanimously to ban her from any future leadership positions. Betty, with her newly adopted confidence and orthopedic sneakers that squeaked with each assertive step, delivered the news with delight. Effective immediately, she read from the podium outside the clubhouse, "Ms. Weller is disqualified from future elections, special roles, or informal organizing under the HOA charter." Frank smiled from his usual patio seat, sipping iced tea and thumbing through the latest issue of the Community Chronicle, formerly the Harmony Herald. His guest editorial, "The Truck Stops Here," ran across the center spread in clean serif type. He didn't mention Joyce by name, but everyone knew. A few blocks over, Joyce's house stood silent. The cone remained on the lawn like a retired sentry. A weather-faded flyer flapped on the mailbox, reading, "Driveway Integrity Matters." The windows were drawn, the "For Sale" sign tilting slightly. Rumors claimed she was moving to an off-grid community in the desert where dogs weren't allowed to bark sarcastically. The Friday potluck began at noon in the Central Park. Folding tables groaned with casseroles, fruit salad, and one mysterious green gelatin. Mr. Rosenthal played a warm jazz melody under the shade of a pecan tree. Children zipped past with scooters and chalk sticks. Someone brought sparklers, even though it was broad daylight. Terry unveiled the new neighborhood welcome sign. On it, hand-painted in cheerful block letters, "Curb Power to the People." The crowd cheered. Mrs. Klein wheeled out 2 flamingos dressed as protesters. One held a sign that said, "I break for democracy." Betty announced she'd signed up for Zumba classes at the rec center. Loretta offered to bake for next month's board meeting. Terry hung a small wooden plaque on Frank's porch that read, "This truck stays." Frank stood quietly for a moment near the dessert table, watching the community settle into something soft and real. Neighbors who once muttered greetings now lingered to chat, trade tomatoes, swap HOA joke ideas. Across the park, a white city vehicle crept toward Joyce's house. Frank elbowed Loretta gently. "Is that?" She followed his gaze. Two workers in khaki uniforms stepped out. One pulled a boot from the trunk and began securing it to Joyce's Lexus, the same one she'd used to patrol Mailbox Heights. A neon yellow flyer was placed under the windshield wiper: violation, unpaid citations, vehicle immobilized. The potluck guests burst into quiet applause. Terry raised his lemonade in salute. Joyce stepped outside just as the second bolt clicked into place. She said nothing. Just stood there, holding a clipboard she no longer had the authority to wield. She glanced toward the gathering, her eyes narrowing. No one waved. Loretta sipped her tea and smiled. They say karma's slow. But here, it drives a Ford F-150. The potluck ended with warm pie, softer smiles, and one less cone on the lawn. Mesa Ridge Gardens didn't just return to peace, it discovered a new kind of strength in shared casseroles, folded petitions, and porchlight conversations. When rules become weapons, it takes more than silence to reclaim a community, it takes neighbors willing to raise their voices and lower their clipboards. Like an old truck parked with quiet defiance, some things stay just to remind us what shouldn't be moved.